Okay, in the last hand, we talked a lot about how we're supposed to approach check raising on static turns. But the reason I included this hand was to give you an example of what our approach should be to check raising on dynamic turn textures. This is literally the quintessential example for the ideal check raising situation you want to put yourself in, so make sure you pay close attention. Ironically, this is a hand where I got owned really badly by my opponent who played the turn perfectly. Everything preflop is standard. We open 3x in the cutoff with Queen 10 7-6 double suited and get 3-bet by a 167 big blind opponent who has been aggressive both preflop and postflop so far. We flop pretty strong on a Queen 8-5 two-tone board with top pair, an open ender, and a flush draw. He c-bets 3/4 pot, and normally this would be an easy stack-off situation if the stacks were 100 big blinds deep in a 3-bet pot. But since the stacks are deeper here, I think it's better just to call. As seems to be the theme in this lesson, the turn is where the magic happens. Or fails miserably if you're the loser in this hand like I ended up being. The dealer peels off the 6 of spades, and our aggressive opponent checks it over to us. Our only options are to check back and evaluate on the river, or take a stab and try to take it down. Which one should we choose? Before we go any further, I want you to recall from this section from the slides where I described the components of the ideal hand for check raising on a dynamic turn. Do you remember what they were? I'll give you a second to think about it. Okay, time's up. The ideal candidates for check raising the turn are hands that have reasonable equity against the top of their stack off range and that have domination potential against everything else. In the hand example, I decided to bet the turn because I felt like his check meant that he was giving up. I also didn't want to give him a free card if he was drawing to a better flush draw or stronger made hand. After I bet 3/4 pot on the turn, he check raised me all in, giving me just better than 2-1 on my money. After some deliberation, I decided that I was getting the right price to call it off, and unfortunately, he had me in pretty terrible shape with only 20% equity. Right now, I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about my turn call. Instead, I wanted to show you the results of the hand first so you can think about exactly what happened in the hand onwards from the flop. As I mentioned before, I think my call on the flop is standard, but the more important result of my flop peel is how it affects my perceived range and the likelihood that I'm going to take a stab on the turn. Something I mentioned in the previous hands was how crucial it is to gauge as best as possible how aggressive your opponents are on the turn. In this case, from his perspective, I'm going to be peeling that flop with a very wide range of hands in a 3-bet pot with these stack sizes. Mostly with the intention of either value betting thinly or taking the pot away on a later street if I don't improve my hand. On the turn, practically my entire peeling range is forced to make a bet. The board is getting wetter, so weak made hands will fire a bet to try to protect their hands. Additionally, all of my strongest hands, like made straights and big semi-bluffs, will oftentimes take a stab at the pot as well. If I was floating with complete air, the turn is a perfect scare card to set up a 2-barrel bluff, or take down the pot against a naked overpair. If he's paying attention, he should definitely know this and be able to play very well against my range. As a rule of thumb, remember that if you find yourself out of position on a dynamic turn and you have a hand that's certainly worth protecting, or has enough equity to play for stacks with, such as a set, 2-pair, or a strong combo draw, all that really matters when choosing a check over a bet is the likelihood the opponent bets. If he has a high turn aggression percentage, it doesn't really matter which hands he's betting. Check raising is going to be the best choice. His best case scenario is that he's folding with hands he should call, or bet calling with hands he should fold. But even when he bet calls with hands that should call after betting, the only reason they should call is because he priced himself in with a bet in the first place. For example, this is exactly what happened to me during the hand you're looking at on the screen, which is why my opponent played the hand perfectly. Put more simply, the only hand he's in bad shape against is a straight. But on this board texture, my range for peeling the flop in a 3-bet pot in position is pretty wide, which means that more often than not, I'll show up with something other than a straight. I ended up making the call because I believed I was getting the right price when I really wasn't. In fact, I only had 20% equity on the turn, so even though I was getting better than 2-1 on my money, I certainly wasn't getting the right price against his actual hand. Also, remember that the proper strategy on dynamic turns requires more semi-bluffing than on static turns. Also remember that on dynamic turns, there's far less bet folding than on static turns, which means that in a dynamic where there's going to be a lot of semi-bluffing and bet calling going on, like the turn you see here, the key is to check raise with a hand that has domination potential and that has equity against the top of my range. This hand definitely fulfills both of those requirements, and accompanied with the fact that I'm likely to put in a bet on this turn a very high percentage of the time, his check raise is simply textbook perfection.